Welcome to In Conversation, a Springer Nature series. I'm Flora Graham, Senior Editor of Nature Briefing, and today I'm very happy to be speaking with Nigel Topping, the Chair of the UK Climate Change Committee. Prior to that, he served as the UN's climate change high-level champion for COP26 in Glasgow and as its global ambassador on the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience. Welcome, Nigel. Thank you very much for joining me.
Hi, Flora. Pleasure to be with you.
Firstly, for those who aren't familiar, can you introduce us to the Climate Change Committee? What is its role?
So the Climate Change Committee was established as part of the Climate Change Act back in 2008 as a body that sits outside of the normal cycle of political um, ping pong. We can call it that. When we have, as in many systems, we have regular shifts of political emphasis, and the job is to provide advice to government and more broadly to Parliament, and specifically to provide advice on 5-yearly carbon budgets. That's the way the Act envisages the rigor and the flexibility to get to our long-term targets. So every 5 years we present a body of evidence and a recommendation. So we've just presented the advice for the 7th carbon budget, or CB7, which runs from 2038 to 2042. So we're thinking quite a long way in advance. We have to model the economy and all the technologies all the way through to 2050. And then we're required by the Act of Parliament every year to issue a progress report saying how well is the government doing against its legislated and legally binding 5-yearly budget targets. So we don't set the targets, we recommend, and then government has to take something to Parliament and set a legally binding target, and then we assess the efficacy of the policy landscape in meeting those targets every year. And then we have a adaptation committee which issues reports on the readiness and the plan for climate adaptation, and that's a process which is ongoing at the moment.
Well, we'll definitely circle back and I'll ask you a little bit more about some of those things, of course. But first of all, can I ask you a little bit about how you got to this role? I think you have a bit of a unique perspective because you spent a long time in business, and often those of us who, whether we be journalists or voters, we have a certain amount of exposure to the political side of the climate change conversation. But a lot of what happens on the business side sometimes happens behind closed doors. So how did your background in business lead you to where you are today?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. So yeah, I've roughly spent half my career, nearly 20 years in business, and now 20 years working outside of business, but on how can we harness the power and the innovation and the capital of the business community to drive solutions to the climate crisis. So I mean, I always had an awareness of climate change, actually from a very early age. I was also a climber as a young man, and I had some experiences in the Arctic, which exposed me to very rapidly retreating glaciers. And I have quite a few friends who are now professors of glaciologists. They were just climbers back then. And then sort of in mid-career, I took some time out and decided what I really wanted to spend the rest of my career on was how do we harness the power of business to tackle climate change. And that was because I kept hearing a lot of people saying business is the problem. I was like, no, I don't think so. I think the system is the problem, and we co-created that. And it's lazy to say business is the problem or debt is the problem. I mean, they may be part of the problem, but they're not the problem, and we need to get closer to root causes. And I felt that sort of rather lazy assessment that business is the problem then means the business is outside of the tent when we're discussing solutions. And I felt very strongly, and I still do, I think the evidence is very strong, that if we're to tackle this crisis, then we really do need all the creativity and power of business, as well as the role of civil society, and of course the role of policymakers. We need all of those, but it's not one or the other. If policymakers believe that business is ready to go a bit further, then they have more courage to legislate further. And if business leaders are confident in stable policy environment, and some of them will be happy to go a bit ahead of the policy signals, and then that starts to get, and of course that feedback loop can work in reverse as well, of like lack of trust, lack of confidence, lack of investment, lack of confidence, lack of policy.
Mm. That's interesting. I mean, from my perspective as a journalist, I think we'll talk a little bit about science communication and the communication of climate change goals later. it all does come down to trust in these relationships. That's so often the case. Let me ask you for readership of scientists, working scientists, some in academia, some in industry, of course. Um, you talked about the feedback loop between industry and politics, but what do you think is the role of scientific researchers in that? What can researchers do to contribute most powerfully to that conversation?
I mean, they're hugely important as providers of trusted evidence. Right, it's not always taken. Sometimes it's twisted, but it's definitely more trusted than evidence that comes just from government or just from business. Right, so it's a sort of backstop of solid, rigorous evidence. Of course, stuff is contested within the academic community. That's part of the whole process that everyone buys into for ensuring robustness. But I think there are very different types of evidence. I mean, I think so. I sort of think of three types of evidence that we really need, and we try and have in the climate change committee. There's the climate scientists. I mean, we have atmospheric science. We have IPCC authors. You know, it is important that we understand the fundamentals of what's going on. But that on its own isn't enough to point to a solution pathway, because that's more a description of what's wrong and what's caused it. And of course, that can point towards what could fix it. But then we need, I think, two things. Increasingly, we see we need behavioral science. We need to understand why people make decisions they make in terms of giving advice to elected politicians. That's pretty important, that they have a sense of whether things are reasonable. You know, we're required to give reasonable advice. Well, there's a sort of there's a test there. We can talk more about some of the citizens panels that we've used to get a sense of what people are thinking um, in the country. And then there's what I call the science of technology disruption, which is a kind of a mixture of um, the engineering research, engineering and other discipline research around solutions. You know, a lot of solutions are developed in labs and then spun out and commercialized. And also the economics of disruption, which is the economics of non-linearity and exponential change, which is a really important discipline and is not well understood and not often present in policy thinking. So I think we need the climate science fundamentals. We need to understand how people react to the evidence and to policies, and then we need to understand what is possible and how fast might things go when it comes to the disruptions necessary.
And from a practical standpoint, if I'm a scientist who's got research that I think is significant to one of these aspects, what would be your kind of top tips for connecting with policymakers?
I think the scientific community generally have gotten much better at translating their language into the language of ordinary people like me and ordinary people like politicians and ordinary people like citizens. So I think that's really important. So I would say one is pursue all the normal routes that give you credibility through rigor. But two, take any advantage you can, if you want to influence policy and others, to expose yourself to training on how to do that, because it's like Mark Twain famously said that the USA and the UK are two countries divided by a common language. Well, that's definitely true of an academic science community and a policy making climate community. It does need a lot of translation.
Mm.
So, but then if you're in the behavioral sciences, I think we're at sort of an earlier stage of really embracing behavioral science evidence. I mean, it's coming in all processes. But I think you maybe need to bang on the door a bit harder. And I think if you're in that sort of solutions space, I think reminding people all the time that understanding the problem is not enough to provide a solution, and that you're there providing solutions. So I think that depending on which of those communities you're in, it's slightly different. But again, always based on being able to show that your evidence is accepted as robust and rigorous by your peer community, because that's what gives it the credibility for people like me to then be able to use it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So now I have to ask for myself and for other science communicators here at Spare Nature. Science communication is obviously a key part of this whole conversation. It's critical for public understanding. We're all very well aware that there's a feeling that maybe there's a bit of a breakdown of consensus at the moment worldwide. But nevertheless, we have a responsibility to give our readers the information they need to make their own decisions. So, let me ask you, what do you think works when it comes to engaging members of the public or the wider scientific community, specifically through communication?
Well, I think two things that I would always bear in mind is one, trying to relate the communication to people's experience, and and I guess it's similar, but trying to speak to people's agency. And so by that I mean if we're just abstract, um, so if we talk in terms of CO2 equivalent ppm, that's that really that's so abstract. So ppm is abstract for most people. CO2 itself is abstract. CO2 equivalent is abstract. So you've got about three abstractions in one phrase. So for most people, they have no idea what you're talking about. If you talk, but you might talk about carbon pollution or fossil fuel pollution or atmospheric pollution.
Mm.
The word pollution is much easier to understand than CO2 equivalent. And in terms of experience, what are people? Sadly, it's easier to talk to people's experience now because many more people have experienced extreme weather, extreme weather events or fires. So I think but then so when I say speak to agency, because if you only sort of shouting about how bad the problem is, most people understand that now, and it's kind of hard just to be told how bad things are, because if your communication ends there, where's the agency? And then okay, so it's interesting. What can I do? And everyone can do something about it. And as a scientist, as a politician, um, as a counselor, as a storyteller, as a lawyer, as an accountant. I mean, as a scientist of every ilk, as an architect, as an engineer. The great thing in a way is that compared to say 10 years ago, there is now a real sense of agency in all of those careers about how I can do something about the climate crisis. No one can solve it on their own. It's a massive collective action problem, but every one of those professions has a role to play in shifting the overall system in the direction of this really big transition that we're in the middle of.
So, we're almost coming up to the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. That's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation today. You were at the COP where the Paris Agreement was agreed. Is that true?
Well, I mean, I was at Paris as the CEO of We Mean Business, which is a coalition we formed about 18 months before to try and bring the voice of businesses who understood that there was a real issue here. They understood the science and understood that business was going to have to be part of the solution, and wanted politicians and negotiators to hear from them, not just um, some lobby groups who were trying to pretend that the problem wasn't as big as it was, or that any solution would be disastrous to humanity. Um, and that was very influential. And so as a result of that, I was in the front row when the gavel came down, because Christiana invited me, because we helped, because that not my voice, but that voice of business that we were able to bring um, to bear. So yeah, we want a strong treaty. We want 2 degrees. Actually, we were fighting for 2 degrees. Then we got better than 2 degrees. This is a non-scientific, but I first went in 2009. I haven't been to every COP. I have been the last 5 or 6. I think that that sense of hope is much more prevalent as the COP process has embraced what the system calls the action agenda. So it used to be just negotiations, and then in Peru, actually, the year before Paris, this idea of the action agenda was born, and we had the Lima Paris Action Agenda in Paris. That's what led to the creation of the Climate Champions role, which I had, and this whole kind of parallel track, which is not negotiated, but which is embraced, and is being embraced. It was embraced a lot more by the British presidency in COP26, and I think now by the Brazilians are elevating that, because there's less and less to negotiate. There is stuff to negotiate. There's important stuff to negotiate, but this really is about implementation and how fast we can implement now. And so that's why I think there's more sense of hope, because more and more people attending are involved in driving solutions, not just as the original setup was, as literally as observers of the process. I mean, the process talks about different observer groups, which is obviously a passive, right? It's important. It's not entirely passive, because you're reporting out and holding to account, but it doesn't have as much agency, or has different agency from implementing solutions. So I think that I share that. I think every year now there are more brilliant people, as I say, from every walk of life, committing their skill, their experience, their life force to driving solutions. And I think that is exciting, and it does give hope, and which we need in the face of the scientific evidence that we are still really behind. Well, we are falling further behind where we need to be.
Well, I know we're almost running out of time, but I'm just going to push on for a couple of minutes. I want to talk just for a second about maybe a bit more of the pie in the sky ideas. So, specifically things like carbon capture and some of the drawing down of carbon, which obviously is secondary to the primary necessity of reducing our uses of fossil fuels. Um, are there any examples, do you think, of promising or interesting areas where this might be happening?
Carbon capture has been long on promise and short on delivery for a long time now. So there's a lot of skepticism around it, but there is some momentum now, and a growing sense from the science community that we will need some, although as the other solutions get better and get implemented faster, less than we might have thought 10 years ago, which is encouraging because it's still expensive and quite a long way
Other
off.
solutions being like renewable energy and things like that, you
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah. So there's a general view now that we don't need carbon capture on or very minimal on fossil fuel plants because we can replace most of those with zero carbon sources. There are other industrial processes like cement where that looks much more difficult because it's a process emission. But I mean, but again, but then the cement industry is very, very big. So the size of the prize, if you can figure out how to decarbonize cement without adding a cost on, and I've always thought the fundamental flaw with the idea of CCS is that you take something that's working and is competitive now, and you add a cost onto it. Meanwhile, people are innovating to try and find alternatives away. So the size of the prize gets bigger because you're not just having to get cheaper than conventional cement, you're getting cheaper than conventional cement plus the on cost of CCS. So we're very careful in the Climate Change Committee advice not to um, assume that technologies that aren't already quite mature suddenly mature and are really helpful. So there's a little bit of upside in our conservatism there. So we do assume some CCS, both industrial and biological, but it's significantly reduced since 5 years ago as a result of some of the other things. And as I say, in some of the work I do with my NGO hat on is looking at the breakthrough technologies, and there's some in the industrial sector, and there's some really interesting stuff happening in cement, which is a really big emitting sector. And with some people now thinking that we've probably found the technologies which will allow us to have zero carbon concrete by the 2040s, which would be a game changer. And a few people will make a lot of money because they've invented something that is really helping the planet. And I think that's quite exciting. And if anyone's going to make a lot of money, I'd quite like it to be someone who's helping us solve this problem.
I'm smiling because cement is just, when you say it's exciting, I think if someone had asked me 20 years ago, Flora, what do you think is one of the most exciting things in science today? I probably wouldn't have said cement, but honestly, I do now. It is something that's really ripe for the picking.
And it's brilliant scientists and engineers who are figuring this out. Right? I mean, and it's right now, right? So I always remember the story of the moon landing in the late 60s, and the story that at the last minute there was this key exchange between two software engineers and a senior engineer, and the two software engineers were like in their 20s and had been in high school when Kennedy said we're going to land on the moon by the end of the decade. So I think if a 16-year-old listening to you or reading you now, in 8 years' time, could be just finishing off their PhD and contributing to one of these companies or their own company that is going to solve one of these big problems. So I think it's a very exciting time for scientists and engineers to be inventing the future.
I really couldn't end on a better note than that. Thank you so much, Nigel, for joining us. I really appreciate your time. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation.
You're very welcome, Flora. Thank you.